Hello, my fellow comic book collectors. This is going to be a bit of a response video. Not something I normally do. I've done it a few times and it always gets me into trouble. So probably this is not going to be any different, but I'm going to respond to a recent video that I just watched from Regie Collects. And Reggie is one of these comic gurus in my mind. He's one of the channels that I most respect. And I want to say that because I'm going to disagree with everything he said. So I kind of want to, mention that I do appreciate his viewpoint, but I don't necessarily agree with his viewpoint. And recently he did a video where he was viewing a very well respected, I think he's a university professor, well-written man who basically looks at culture and looks at comics and does the analysis of where comics are going and the current trends within comics and stuff like that. And the question that they kind of were discussing is about diversity in comics. And I want to kind of clarify things. So way back when, I used to do debating when I was in high school. And one of the things that you do in debates is you clarify terms. So, typically you got to define the terms, and then that way you have a common understanding of what you're actually talking about. So when you talk about diversity, I like to clearly define that as anything non-white and maybe even non-heterosexual too. Because of the fact, well, it can be either or, I should say. Because generally when they say like things are more diverse, they really mean that they're less white people in them. And I always hated that term for that reason, that, they always say the most diverse sport is like basketball. Well, if you ever watch basketball, it is like mostly black. And to me, that's not diversity. Diversity would be a mixture of people. Ideally, it could be like whatever percentage, everyone's represented. And not necessarily, I don't necessarily think that's a good thing even. And I don't necessarily understand why that would be a good thing. I think, I don't go to, I've traveled the world. I've been to all of Asia. I've been to, many countries in Europe, and I enjoy those cultures because they are those cultures and they're not diverse. When I lived in Korea for 3 years, it's a very homogenous society, and I appreciated their culture because of the fact that it is homogenous. It has like deep, like 5,000 year history. It has its own mythology, legends, traditions, and it's, very interesting. And when I went there, I didn't say, hey, Korea, you got to change your society to meet my needs. I went there with this idea that I would have to learn the language. I would have to, learn how to assimilate into their culture. And that to me is an interesting thing. But nowadays, that is one of the pushes that they've been making, is this kind of globalist idea that we're all the same. We all can just, we can all just mix in, match, and whatever. And I think what happens when you do that is you really kill the cultures that are involved. It just becomes a mesh of just whatever, and it's sort of like if you take food and you mix in a whole bunch of ingredients, sure, you've created diversity in that food, but it just becomes not real thing. It just becomes like whatever. Whereas if you, kind of focus on what that food should be, like spaghetti should be a certain way, pizza should be a certain way, and certain things you can mix stuff in, but there has to be some basis, some basic idea about how that thing is. For example, pizza is a great example. Pizza, what is pizza? It's a big flat piece of bread with some toppings on it, and those toppings can be varied. It should have cheese, and actually, when I lived in Greece for a while, uh, they had really they were really specific about what pizza had to be. It had to be a certain thickness, and it had to be square, and it was all these kind of things. And they were very particular, and they said certain things were not allowed to be on pizza. So it's really interesting. Um, but and that those rules do define what that thing is. And if you just have it where, oh, it doesn't have to be bread anymore, it can be whatever, well, then it's no longer the thing that you're dealing with. And the reason I kind of give all this preamble, and I really want to bring it back to comics, is what happens is this push for diversity is often what they're doing is generally they're taking like traditionally white characters, and the reason they're traditionally white characters, and it's not because of racism. Like the immediate jump is like, oh, they must be racist because they're all white characters. That's not necessarily the truth. It's cultures will create characters based on their culture, and it just happened to be that North America was traditionally mostly white. It was European stock that formed these countries, and not going that far back. We're not talking like like hundreds of years ago. We're talking like 30, 40 years ago. Like, the demographic shift in North America has been significant. It's been very fast. And the culture is being kind of disrupted as a result. But when a lot of these comics were created, like when Superman was created, like, US was like 90% white. So of course the characters are going to be mostly white. And they did throw in black characters, and they, because the other big population within the United States were like blacks. So they did have those characters in there, but it was proportional. Or, the majority kind of determined what the characters would look like. And so these comics really became a reflection of that white culture that was the predominant culture within that time period, and even to today. So I don't necessarily think that comics should, stay all white, and therefore, and no diversity should be in comics. I don't really think that that's a good thing either. Because that doesn't make sense. I'm a very capitalistic guy in the way I think. I believe if there's a market for it, then feed that market. Like if there's a demand from a black audience, from a like Hispanic audience, or whatever, like Indian audience, whatever the audiences are, for their own representation in comics, then fine. Create comics for them. The majority of the world is non-white. Like white people are actually the kind of the minority of the world. It's just a fact that there's not many white people on this planet compared to all the other groups. We're we're maybe the most vocal minority in terms of how much influence we've had on this world, and it's because of all the great things that came out of Europe. But that doesn't mean that there's not stories from all the rest of the world. There's a vast world and a vast number of stories from all those other cultures. And I don't see anything wrong with entertaining those other cultures and building content related to those other cultures. So I wouldn't like, that's why anime does so well. Anime will generally, reflect Japanese culture and traditions and ideas and the way that they think. The stories all have a very Japanese kind of philosophy behind them. And when I was in Korea, like a lot of the Korean storytelling had that sort of Korean way of thinking, very different than Japanese. Um, so, why not? You know, if you're really trying to cater to diversity, it doesn't mean that you have to have like one comic with like every single little group represented. What you can do is you can make a whole new comic with their own characters, their own stories. Kind of would be, and you'd probably even get like non whatever that group is, uh people reading those things because they would be interesting. Like you know um I'm a big fan of history, and I really enjoyed I enjoy African history and I enjoy Asian history. And I don't enjoy it just because like I don't enjoy it, as if we should put white characters playing in, those roles. I just enjoy it for what it is. Like I wouldn't want Shaka Zulu to be a white guy. I want him to be, a traditional Zulu man, and I would want, to see him that way and understand his history that way. I don't need to be represented in that story, because it's not related to me. But I can still enjoy that story. So I think that that's the way we should really treat comics. That we should, if there is that demand, build comics around it. Without, and I really want to make people understand this, that what we're doing now is we're sabotaging one culture, which is generally a traditionally white culture, in order to cater to other cultures. So we take Superman, for example, and we make him either gay or like or black or whatever. We make him something to appeal to a greater audience. Because as I said, white people are the minority. So, they want to make him appeal to other people rather than just making a black character who maybe is kind of like Superman, but has some other things that kind of reflect those other groups. Why do you have to steal from one culture and really sabotage it? I don't think that black people and white people and Hispanic people and Asian people are all interchangeable. I don't think you can just take a traditionally white character that has a whole tradition behind that character. Like Batman is a certain way. Superman is a certain way. He's a boy from Kansas. He's a, they look a certain way. He's actually an alien, but other than that, that's a whole different topic. But there is a culture there, and that is reflected in that character's development. And it's not just that he's like been created today. This character has existed for 80 years. And there's a lot of culture that's been built into that character. So I don't think you can just ignore all that and then say, oh, well, let's just make him black. It's insulting to that heritage that really formed the character. And it's also insulting to the race that you just swapped into it. Like, basically you're saying to black people that the only way you can tell a black story is if you take an existing popular character that's a white character and make them black. That's the only way. And that's very insulting, and it's demeaning to black people, because I believe that, as I said, I enjoy like there's like a whole bunch of these African stories that are actually kind of brilliant and need to be told, that could be told, and don't need to leverage some white character in order to get that interest. So I could see, like, why not do that rather than taking some other culture and just kind of stripping it apart and putting in some diverse character. It's just so demeaning to that culture that you switched in. One of the things that Regie said that really bothered me, and I kind of want to debunk this, and this is a myth that exists within the woke culture, is the concept that there is no such thing as race. That is just not true. It's just scientifically not true. it's it's just not true. And I have to debunk this because uh, it it's important to understand. Because first of all, if there is no such thing as race and we're all basically the same, then we are interchangeable. And therefore, seeing a black character, a white character, or whatever character doesn't mean anything. It doesn't, why, you wouldn't need to see representation because we're all the same. Like, well, why do you even have to switch it then? Because if we're basically the same, then having that character still remain white should be fine because you and him are basically the same, and there's no need for representation. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't make sense if you don't, if we're all the same, then there shouldn't be any need for representation because any person can represent you, and that it just doesn't fundamentally doesn't make sense. I don't think anyone really believes that. But the concept of race itself is really just a classification. When you study, like, classification has been around for over 2,000 years. It was Aristotle. I'm really into philosophy, by the way. Aristotle that came out with the concept of classification, and basically, you can the basic classifications are invertebrates and vertebrates, and like then you get into families and genres and species, and then once you get kind of down deep into like a certain group like of species, then you can say, well, these species actually have subgroups, which are race, and ethnicity would be even a subgroup. So you can say, well, white people represent Europe, let's say, as a way of grouping them, and that's fairly accurate way of grouping some, like the Europeans. And if you look at the edges of Europe and the edges of like Middle East and Asia and Africa, even a lot of the people in those edges are kind of very similar. Like, you can't really say, are they white, are they African? But there are kind of those people that are in between. However, the majority that within that European group, these people haven't really moved around very much. Like, that's what generally creates the different groups of people, is that they traditionally didn't move much. Like, you could actually have people literally maybe only a few miles away from each other and be totally different people, totally different cultures, totally different like ideologies, ways of being. Even the look of the people could be very different, and they've only been separated by a few miles. And the reason for that was people didn't move much. It's only a recent phenomena that we have cars and airplanes and things that allowed us to move around a lot that really kind of created this mixing of groups. But generally what you have to see is that race is like a real thing. It's like there's groups here, there's Europeans, there's Asians, and Asians could really be divided into Middle Easterns, Indian, and Chinese, and then subgroups. Southeast Asians are very different than Northeast Asians, very different. There's you could easily subgroup it, and that's all race is. It's this idea of grouping it. And when you look at groups, you can say, well, these people kind of fit into these groups. And it's not based on skin color. That's one of the biggest misconceptions. I hate that conception of, oh, it's all based on skin color. No, it's not. That's very non-scientific way of looking at race. It's actually that the races are very different. They have different body structures. You can actually look at a skeleton and say, oh, they're white or black or whatever. You can actually look at their DNA and say, hey, look, Europeans will have a bit of Neanderthal mixed in, and Africans don't have any of that. So they're very they're different genetically, and the amount of difference in between the different groups that we've created, and we call them races, um, is actually as much difference as the different dog breeds. It's actually more of a difference. There's actually as much difference between the different races as there is between a dog, like a poodle, and a wolf. There's that much difference in the human races as well. And there's a lot of that when we ignore the concept of race, we really ignore a lot of the cool things that make us different. And I actually like the concept of race for the fact that it really allows us to appreciate the differences. And going back to comics on that idea, is that's why I don't like the idea of just swapping out people, because you ignore the differences. You ignore the things that make us cool. That's why I think it would be really, I'd love to see true diversity in comics. I'd love to see more comics created that reflect all the diversity that's out there. And like, I'd like to see more comics from an African perspective. I'd like to see more comics from an Asian perspective. And maybe even ethnicity wise, like some Greek or like Turkish, or that'd be those two groups hate each other. Different groups. Like, I'd love to see that. I think it would be very fascinating. But it should be told from their perspective and for those audiences. And I think that would be interesting. And that is diversity. But you don't have to have like your Wonder Woman comic or Superman comic or X-Men comic reflecting that, vast diversity. You can maintain the characters the way that they were traditionally written. And there is a certain amount of diversity that you have to start including in some of those stories, I believe, because American society has changed a bit. But I don't think you have to do it at the expense of the traditional characters. I think you can add in new characters that reflect that changing diversity within the American population. So I know this has been a bit of a rant, but I kind of wanted people to understand this in a very different way. I really don't like the woke culture that is in comics today. I think often it has a very negative way of including things like political ideologies being put into it. And some of the, like, I really want to address this in a way. Some of the things that I find very negative that I see in comics is the idea that, and I see this more in movies than, I'll still see it in a lot of comics too, but I see it as now that it's really a common thing to put in new stereotypes, like, of what a character is. So if you're a black character in a movie nowadays, you're generally the smartest man in the room. And that's the way they kind of put it. And if you're if you're a white character, you're generally the bad guy. If you're watching a movie nowadays and you see a white guy in the movie, that's the one that's probably going to be the bad guy or do something at the end that kind of reflects something negative. That's kind of where things are going. And another thing that they'll do is they'll mix in mixed couples. Like, I'm actually from a mixed couple. My wife is Asian. So, I have nothing against mixed couples, but it's not really reflective of the greater society. I know why they do it is like, oh, if we have a mixed couple, then we can have one of each. And it's like they're trying to get the checkbox rather than just have something that's a little bit more realistic. Like, what ultimately drives me, this is like an aside, is one of the things that drives me nuts is you see like a white woman, usually it's a white woman, black man, and then the children are Asian. It's like, genetics doesn't work that way. It just drives me crazy. Like I just don't understand like why they have to have like that ultimate inclusion and like, diversity that doesn't even make sense anymore, and it really kind of disjars you from the story, and it doesn't make any sense. So I really hate that, and I find that it really doesn't it doesn't allow for people to suspend disbelief and engage in that story. So it's just an aside, but one of the things that I see in movies nowadays is that they have these kind of tropes that they use. Like as I said, the black character has to be the best best ever character. The white character is always the evil guy. Women are just as strong as men, always nowadays, and it's just it makes it so that it's not interesting. You know, you can almost look at the first scene of the movie and you say, okay, well, that's a white character. He's the bad guy. There's a black guy. Oh, he must be the hero. Oh, there's a woman. She's gonna, do this because she's like just as good as any man. And you can almost predict the whole story within just seeing the characters. And that's really not interesting. Like people don't work that way. And I, I kind of want it to be more like a good example of this is Squid Game. like, if you watch Squid Game, because we don't know those people, like those actors are not ones that are famous outside of Korea. They are actually famous people, by the way. And my wife always goes on, "Oh, that guy's actually really famous," um, but but they're not characters that we like, people that we know outside of outside of Korea. And as a result, when you watch the show, you have no idea what's going to happen. And that makes it very interesting because it's like, is this guy going to die? Or because he seems cool, I like him, or is he going to survive? We don't know. We can't tell because it's one of those things where it's not like a trope or a stereotype. Oh, this character is going to do this because it's based on diversity. We know that it has to go that way, and I think that's what's interesting. And again, back to representation. I can watch Squid Game. I can enjoy Squid Game. There's no white people there. The only white, actually, there is white people in it. I shouldn't say that. But again, even in Squid Game, the white guys are the evil ones. And just so people know, this is kind of funny thing about Korea. There's only really only a few types of white people in Korea. And this is just an aside that will explain why the acting for the white guys is so bad. And it was actually the worst part of Squid Game is like whenever the white guys would come in, I was like, oh, they're so terrible. it's just like so annoying. But I didn't want that representation because they're bad representation. But I want to explain why they're so bad. In Korea, there's only a few types of white people. Okay, there's U.S. military. Okay, there is English teachers, which are traditionally white guys, and then then there's Mormons. Okay, and then there's these Russian guys that come into Russian men and women that come into Korea, and they're usually business people. There's a lot of business that happens between Russia and Korea. So those are the four groups. Now, if you think about those four groups, you got U.S. military. They would not do acting. They would never get involved with acting, and they're actually one of the biggest groups. English teachers, sometimes they kind of do acting on the side if they can, but it's not that often. The Mormons, definitely not. They would never do acting. They would never get involved with that. Though there has been a few reality shows where a few of the Mormons stayed in Korea and actually became kind of Korean. But for the most part, they would not do it. So you get these Russian guys that will do it, and they don't speak English very well. And so you get these Russian guys pretending to be American, and it feels really weird. And that's why it does come across as like, what are these, why are they so bad at acting? It's just that, as I said, English is not going to be their first language, and generally they're trying to put on an American thing, and they don't really know what that is. So it's just something to know. Um, and so yeah. But one of the things that they like to do in movies, and we do it here as well, is they like to include like white people, and that's so that they can appeal to that North American audience. I don't know why they make us evil, but they, but they do that in order to try to appeal to that North American audience. We do the same. We'll have like Black Panther, for example, which is really an African centric story. All of a sudden he'll go to China for no apparent reason. Like, it's like, okay, why are you off to Asia? Like, doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense for the story, but it's done in order to try to get those groups to embrace the movie. So yeah, that's why diversity doesn't work, and that's a really good like situation that explains why diversity doesn't work. Had Black Panther just been Black Panther, like make it an African centric story with a bit of that North American thing, because Black Panther does come to North America, but have that. It doesn't make sense to do it the other way around with all this other stuff that just isn't relevant to Black Panther. So yeah, I'm trying to show my case against diversity, but diversity in a very different way. I think that the way that they're doing it is completely wrong. And I think there is a way to achieve, if you really feel that these groups are not being represented, then build stories for those groups that are about those groups. And that is less about pandering as much as it is about providing something that the market is demanding. If the market demands more representation, give it to them. Give it to them. And if it succeeds, then great. You capitalized on something that has demand. But traditionally what they're doing is they're not looking at it from that market perspective. Making a traditionally white character something else, or a traditionally straight character something else, is not done in order to appeal to the market. It is done to virtue signal. And generally what it does is it pisses off the market. The market says, we don't like that. and the book will actually do worse, and comics will suffer as a result. And so I always think you should pander to the market rather than pandering to virtue or perceived virtue. There is no virtue in destroying your comic and destroying the traditions in your comic. That is not virtuous in my mind. It is virtuous to tell stories and to tell good stories that intrigue people and maybe make people excited about those other cultures. Part of the reason why I wanted to go to Asia and wanted to experience that whole difference in culture was I enjoyed watching Bruce Lee movies, or I enjoyed, I did judo. I enjoyed that culture. I didn't need to see myself like being Bruce Lee. I didn't need to think that way. I enjoyed it for what it was. And that made me interested and wanted to learn more. And that's what's cool. I think it's so hard to really talk about this. And one of the things I think we should do more often is talk about this. I really don't like the idea of people talking about race too much. I always left a bad taste in my mouth that, I really think that's kind of the least of the least of the important things. There's so much more to any individual. Like, I don't see somebody and say, oh, they're a black person, so therefore, It's like, I just don't, I think it's like the least interesting thing about that person. So when I see Reggie, he's a black guy. I don't think, oh, he's a black guy, therefore I have to think of him this way. I think of him as a black guy who who happens to love comics just as much as I do, and he's a cool guy, and he has all these kind of cool ideas, and you know, um, and I enjoy him for that, and he just happens to be black. I prefer that way of thinking, and I think most people think that way. At least I hope that most people think that way. And if they don't, I think that's what's the problem with these diversity books, these like inclusive books, is that they don't think that way. They think that the character doesn't, it has, like, the first most important thing about that character is their race. And to me, that's kind of racist. Like, that's kind of the definition of racist. But so that's, to me, the thing that they focus on. And it always drives me nuts. So back to what I said at the very beginning of this video, and this is, sorry, a bit of a long rant. At the very beginning of this video, I talked about how one of the things that they'll say is that, we have to have inclusiveness and we have to have representation. And then they'll say at the same time that we're all the same. There is one race and all this kind of stuff. And you can know, like, that is one of the things that's a red flag to me, that they are not speaking the truth. Because when you say that we're all the same, you are ignoring. It's almost as bad. Like I actually like the idea of being colorblind, like the traditional Martin Luther King concept of that, where you judge people first. You can notice that, hey, that person's white or whatever, Asian or whatever, but you first recognize them as an individual, and then you learn about them, and you see that their culture and their, like, identity, as whatever it is, as adding to that individual. So, you can't take that culture out of that person. Now, obviously, that's going to be a major part of who they are, but it is not the quintessential element of who they are. Whereas a lot of the writers nowadays, they ignore all that culture, in a way, that all that value, the things that make them cool, and they just say, well, it's skin color. Like, if we just make that character black skinned, therefore they are the same. We don't really see them as anything different. But now we have that inclusion and therefore representation, which ignores everything that gives that character substance. It really frustrates me. So I just see it so much where, you get black characters, especially in movies, where, like, you can tell they're pretending to be white, and sure, their skin color, isn't like that essential, but it is essential to whoever made that commercial. Like, when I watch commercials now, it's like every single commercial is like 90% black, and it's not, you can tell it's not done because those are the best actors or the best people for the role. It's based on this whole idea of inclusion and diversity, blah, blah, blah. And it just comes across as like, wow, why are you getting these black people to pretend that they're white? They don't act like they're white. It just comes across as like, do you really think that we're all interchangeable? Do you really think that we don't have our own rich cultures? It's so insulting. It just drives me crazy. Like, I have so many black friends, because of where I live. I have very few white friends, like very few. Most of my friends are Indian or black or like pretty much anything. Like, there's about 150 different cultures in the GTA. It's very diverse. And my friends reflect that diversity. And I think, well, if I just treated them as all being the same without having any of that culture behind them, I'd be like very insulting to them. I think that'd be very, very like looking down upon their very unique cultures. And a lot of my friends are, either first or second, usually mostly first generation Canadian. So that culture is very part of who they are because they really haven't learned the Canadian culture, and it's really hard for them to learn the Canadian culture. They kind of use me for that. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm the best representation of that, um, they really depend on me to learn a bit of the Canadian culture, and they impart in their culture on me, where I learn a bit about their culture. And I'm very interested. I love history. I love like learning about other cultures. I love learning about their home countries. Um, so you know, I see that as like very cool. But it's very frustrating to me that nowadays, especially in comics, they literally just paint the character. Oh, don't use don't use the white crayon. We use the brown crayon, and therefore we've got our little check mark. I just drives me crazy, and it really does ignore all that extra value that that character could bring to the story. Um, yeah, that's a bit of my rant. I hope I kind of explained myself reasonably well without kind of being a little bit incoherent, because I talk about so many ideas. But I wanted to give you my fresh take, almost like my knee-jerk reaction to what I saw on Regie Collects. And I'll link his video in the description, just so you can check out what they were saying. I mean, a lot of it I can understand where they're coming from, because Black people have been traditionally underrepresented. Now they're overrepresented, but I think they want more representation. They want it to be they as a minority, you always kind of want to have your culture being the dominant culture. It's part of being a minority. When I was in Asia, I was annoyed half the time because of the fact that they would do things very different than the way I would want to do them. And I can understand the frustrations that other groups have within the greater culture, where they are a minority and their culture is not necessarily being reflected in the mainstream. And I can really appreciate that. I really understand that. But I don't think what we're seeing in comics is helping that situation. I don't see that just switching out the crayons that are being I say crayons, it's so insulting to artists, but just switching out those colors really makes any difference. Like, it's not really solving the problem. As I said, if you really want diversity in comics, make diverse stories. Make stories that reflect the people that you're trying to appeal to. And that's ultimately, if you take anything away from what I said today, that's really what I'm saying. Like, I want more diversity because by telling more diverse stories. And that's, I think, the best way of achieving more representation for the people that feel underrepresented. Okay, so again, thanks for watching. Leave a comment below. What do you think about this? Am I just insane? Like, you can tell me. I don't mind. It is what it is. Okay, thanks again. Bye for now.